And now, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for Plenary Session 1, Dr. Brendan Kelly. Brendan is currently serving as Director of Conservation Research and Chief Scientist at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Previous to his work at the aquarium, Brendan served as the Assistant Director for Polar Science in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy for President Obama. He has also served as Deputy Director of Arctic Sciences at the National Science Foundation, as a research scientist at NOAA's National Marine Mammal Laboratory, and as a professor of marine biology at the University of Alaska Southeast. Brendan has over 35 years of experience studying marine mammals. His research in the North Pacific, the Arctic, and Antarctica is extensive. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brendan Kelly to the stage.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Dean Testy, Rachel, you're doing a tremendous service here by putting on this event. I'm particularly attracted to this event because it's not happening in Alaska, and as dearly as I love Alaska, this is a conversation that needs to be happening all across the country, and I really applaud your efforts to do that. Many of you probably know what I'm about to tell you, but because this is a broader conversation and people are coming in who haven't necessarily been talking about the Arctic for all their career, and I think that's a very important thing, I'm going to say what might be obvious to others, which is that the United States is assuming the chair of the Arctic Council. And this is a duty that rotates among the member states every 2 years. Our first panel is going to describe what the significance of that and how the United States will take on those duties. I'm very pleased to introduce these panelists. These are two great leaders in Arctic science and policy. Fran Ulmer has a very distinguished career as a government and academic leader in Alaska, and the Obama administration has repeatedly called on her deep knowledge and commitment to Alaska and the Arctic. President Obama appointed her to the National Commission on the BP oil spill. He subsequently appointed her to be the chair of the Arctic Research Commission, duties she's still undertaking, and now she has had it added to those duties, advising Secretary Kerry as an advisor on Arctic science and policy. Dr. Adrianna Muir is a deputy senior Arctic official at the State Department. She also has demonstrated tremendous leadership in Washington, both working for the State Department on Arctic policy issues and the Department of Interior. She's been at this, I think, since she was a AAAS fellow at the State Department, as I recall. So I will turn over the discussion to them, and we'll have time for questions after both speakers. Is that going to work for you too? Okay, Fran?
Good morning, everyone. I want to apologize at the outset. I have a head cold, so if I sneeze at you, don't be offended. I want to say thanks very much to Kelly and to Rachel for organizing the event and for hosting it, and for all of you who have come today to spend time sharing information, sharing ideas, learning from each other, and hopefully taking another step forward toward understanding at a very personal and professional level the very significant challenges of the Arctic region. I was asked to speak this morning primarily on the U.S. chairmanship for the Arctic Council. And what I'm going to do is do kind of a 101 on the Arctic Council, and Adrianna is going to spend a little more of a deep dive into the U.S. chairmanship agenda. Now, I know a number of you in this room already know a lot about the Arctic Council, But it's been my understanding, and I think it's really true, that honestly we take a lot for granted about what people know and what they don't know. And so indulge me, I will go through a bit of a lecture hall kind of 101 on the Arctic Council. But before I do that, I want to just for a moment pick up on the theme that Rachel has launched, and that is the rapid rate of change. Now, for those of you who attend Arctic conferences, you know we often talk about the Arctic and how much the rate of change, whether it's climate change, globalization, the race for resources, are all of those combining to really create quite a storm in the Arctic, in the sense that there are lots of issues and lots of passions and lots of information and lots of suggestions about what we might do and how we might do it. But as I was flying from Tromsø to Oslo, Oslo to DC, and then eventually DC to Seattle, I read Craig's recent publication from this law school on the Arctic Year in Review, 2014. And honestly, it crystallizes for me something that I hadn't really thought about until I read that, and I encourage you all to read it. And that is how much change has actually taken place in the issue generation and governance aspect of Arctic policy just within the last year or two. Just within the last year or two. And I mean, the world we live in is actually quite a bit different. Think about the price of oil, for example. I mean, who would have thunk it, right? A year ago. And the price of oil, as it turns out, really has a big impact on development, the pace of development, where it takes place, particularly if you are in high-risk or high-cost areas. Tensions with Russia. You know, the Arctic Council and the Arctic region has been a place where the Arctic 8 for many, many years have had really excellent relations, and so far still do. But clearly what has changed in terms of the tensions with Russia, not just for us, but with the EU, with Canada, et cetera, really makes for kind of a changed environment as we think about what's going on in the Arctic. Denmark has just submitted its claims for its extended continental shelf under UNCLOS. The IMO Polar Code is moving forward. You'll hear more about that from Lawson in a really dramatic and positive way. The state of Alaska stepped up with AAPC, the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission. You'll hear more about that later as well. And they have delivered a package of policy recommendations to the legislature this month. A lot of really interesting and important things have changed. And I would submit to you that another piece of that is the US federal government's engagement in the Arctic. So in 2013, the administration adopted a national Arctic strategy. In 2014, the administration adopted the implementation plan for that Arctic strategy. This month, the administration issued an executive order to make a little more of an orderly movement toward the implementation of that implementation plan and that strategy. All really within a very short period of time, relative to how much time had passed for a long, long, long time, where the US really hadn't spent that much time on Arctic issues or Arctic policy, at least not as much perhaps as we Alaskans would have liked. The Department of Defense last fall declared climate change as a threat multiplier. The Department of Interior has almost issued oil and gas regulations for drilling in the Arctic. I could go on and on with things that have very significantly recently changed, but I'm going to talk to you about what is about to change, and that is the US becoming the chair of the Arctic Council, providing a lot of attention to and hopefully interest in, not just among people who already care about the Arctic, but for other Americans as well. So the Arctic Council started back actually before 1996, but in 1996, the Ottawa Declaration made it quite clear that the 8 Arctic nations wanted to cooperate, primarily focused on 2 things: sustainable development and protection of the Arctic environment. The member states, the 8 Arctic nations, have been very actively engaged in the Council since its very beginning, but unquestionably in recent years, everything has been stepped up in terms of intensity. Another rather unique and wonderful aspect of the way in which the Arctic Council is organized, that it includes active participation by the indigenous people of the region through the permanent participants, both here in the US and elsewhere, in a way that has really enriched the opportunity for the Arctic Council to do its work in a responsible way. In addition, there are a number of observer states, even though they're not in the Arctic, but they are countries that have an interest in the Arctic for a variety of reasons and have petitioned to become observer states. That list, I might note, it has gotten longer within the last year, and it is likely to get longer as there is quite a substantial list of additional countries that would like observer status. There are also observer international organizations, and they range from the parliamentarians of the Arctic region to the Nordic Council of Ministers, the Marine Mammal Commission of the North Atlantic, a number of entities that have both expertise and policy responsibility in the Arctic. There are also a number of observer NGOs, everyone from the University of the Arctic and the Northern Forum to the Association of World Reindeer Herders and the World Wildlife Fund. It's quite a diverse group, but again, people who have a passion for, an interest in, and expertise in this region to contribute to the work of the Arctic Council. The governance is really quite basic in the sense that the council meets at the minister level, that is at the level of Secretary John Kerry and his equivalents at the beginning and at the end of a chairmanship, and that chairmanship rotates every 2 years. And the senior Arctic officials who really kind of steer the course of the Arctic Council work, Julie Gorley is our senior Arctic official. They meet twice a year. But the real work of the Arctic Council really happens at the working group level. And the working groups have been the same pretty much from the beginning with a couple of changes. But these entities, AMAP, ACAP, CAF, EPPR, PAIM, and SDWG, and you know you've been to a conference before if you know what those mean, have been the workhorses and the way in which the work of the Arctic Council actually gets done. In terms of the structure, this is probably more than you want to know, but the working groups do their work with a variety of participants, both federal agency people and permanent participants and the observers and other experts. That work goes up to the senior Arctic officials and then eventually to the ministers for either acceptance, approval, or in some cases, action. So in the area of national and homeland security, obviously there's been an increased amount of effort on oil spills. Rachel mentioned how devastating the Exxon Valdez spill was in Alaska, how devastating the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was in the Gulf of Mexico. There have been others. We don't want one in the Arctic. And the 8 Arctic nations have taken on as a high priority issue and one of their first agreements to really work together to not only be prepared in case there is one, but also to work on prevention. And a lot of that work was done by the working group PAIM, the Protection of the Marine Environment, and it continues in a way that really adds value in terms of understanding the environment and making certain that the regional entities, treaties, et cetera, that are in place to protect the marine environment are actually being monitored. EPPR, the Emergency Prevention and Preparedness and Response, they have produced amazing reports, and if I can ask of you only one thing, it is that you will actually go to the Arctic Council website and look at the amazing array of resources that are available to you in each of these working groups. The Search and Rescue Agreement, the other main accomplishment in terms of actual agreements in recent years, also focuses on a big and tough problem, and that is how do you respond in an area as vast as the Arctic Ocean, and one that has such few infrastructure and response capacities in existence today. The Search and Rescue Agreement and moving forward under it to make sure that there is appropriate levels of communication among the departments that are responsible for search and rescue in their own regions, are able to talk cross borders, and are able to plan with tabletop exercises and with in-field experiments is a very important part of the responsibility. I know you can't really read that slide on the Sustainable Development Working Group, but I think it's important to just look at the range of issues that come under that working group, from human health to adaptation to climate change, from managing natural resources to preserving Arctic cultures and languages. There have been a number of excellent products, again, produced under this working group as well, including the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment follow-ups. Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, AMAP, a lot of the work that's done on climate change, but also that work that was done on mercury and persistent organic pollutants, or POPs. Also incredibly important to the people of the Arctic in terms of maintaining health, because we know that a lot of unfortunate, the way in which both wind currents and water currents carry pollutants to the Arctic is something that means that the entire globe has a responsibility toward assuring that these pollutants are kept to an absolute minimum. In recent years, there's been a lot of discussion about how the Arctic 8 can do a better job of coordinating science and sharing data and making sure that efforts that are underway, both by government, by universities, by the private sector, can be as effectively leveraged as possible. So there's been a task force on science cooperation. It is moving toward an agreement. It is not quite ripe, but I think it will be within the next year or two. And it is a structure that will give a little more of a comfort zone for everyone who wants to understand how the science is being coordinated. The Arctic Council Secretariat is in Tromsø, Norway. They provide support and assistance, everything from technology to reports. And speaking of reports, I want to mention that at the back table, actually I think outside the door, there's a one-pager on the Arctic Council. So if some of what I have told you today about the structure went by too quickly and you want to pick up that one-pager, it is something that was produced by the Arctic Council Secretariat that would make it easier for you to think about how you might want to engage with some of the working groups in the future. As I mentioned, the chairmanship passes from Canada to the United States this spring. Canada had as its principal focus under its chairmanship development for the people of the North. That will continue under the U.S. chairmanship under one of the three important areas of emphasis for us, improving the economic and living conditions of people in the Arctic. But in addition to that, we're emphasizing Arctic ocean stewardship and addressing climate change. And Adrianna is about to come and talk to you more about the various projects under these three themes. In closing, I just want to encourage you, if the Arctic is still a little new to you and you would like on kind of an ongoing basis to learn more and stay in touch with what is going on in the Arctic, whether it's science, policy statements, new agreements, interesting discoveries, big meetings, you need to sign up for the daily update. Go to arctic.gov. www.arctic.gov is the website for the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. The Commission has a lot of resources on that site, our goals report, workshop reports, et cetera. But the thing that I want to encourage you particularly to look for is signing up for the daily update, because it's just an electronic newsletter that will kind of keep you up to date on the many things that are changing in the Arctic. So with that, again, thank you very much for being here, and I will pass this mic to Adrianna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, for the invitation. I'm really honored to represent State Department for you this morning. And I'm privileged to try and give you a bit of a snapshot as to what we're seeing coming in the next couple of years. And similar to Fran, I have to start off with an apology. Not that I have a cold, but that I'm going to run you through the paces very quickly. If I were to do justice to our plans, it would take a couple hours, and to not blow up your conference timing in the onset, I'll try and go a bit fast. So here we go. That's the last slide, I think. Let's see what happens. Right. Well, let's see, can I recall, there we go. To start off, I think the next slide, here we are. Our chairmanship theme, title, or brand, if you will, is One Arctic, Shared Opportunities, Challenges, and Responsibilities. And it gets to the heart of what you basically heard from Brendan and from Fran. And this is really looking at an area where you're seeing a lot of change, you're seeing new opportunities, new challenges. And the way we're trying to shape this into the chairmanship is that for us, it therefore means there's new responsibility, and it's an international responsibility to address both of those together. For the US, say for the way we're approaching this domestically, more so that's a sustainable view towards cultural identity, environmental protection, and development. And as Fran mentioned, we're trying to also expand this such that we're giving a message to people who are outside of the Arctic so that they can understand that they too have a responsibility with us as we move forward because of the way that their actions can impact the Arctic. For the chairmanship, we have 3 overarching goals that we basically assigned ourselves to take on. And I'll go through each of these in a bit more in the presentation. First and foremost, it's to introduce new long-term priorities into the Arctic Council, primarily through work that you'll see the working groups taking on. Second, it's to continue strengthening the Arctic Council as an intergovernmental forum, so sort of leaving it better than we found it, as many other chairmanships have also attempted to do. And third, we'd like to launch a big public awareness campaign to raise Arctic and climate change awareness within the United States and across the world to basically take advantage of the fact that we're sitting in the limelight. And so now's our opportunity to really bring this message forward. But before I go any further, I'd just like to back up and tell you a bit about the process that we've undergone, because I think it's been quite unique and other chairmanships haven't quite done it this way. When we started off over a couple years ago, beginning to gather input for what we could try and take on during the chairmanship, it was coming from all different sources, and it actually continues to still come in. First and foremost, it was through the US government and all of the different agencies, asking them for ideas as to what we could put forward through the chairmanship, especially because that's where we really empower those workhorses that Fran described in the Arctic Council for the US. It's through the work groups, and it's mainly through our other government agencies. Through Alaska, there were different listening sessions that were held by State Department. There were a lot of input that came in from, of course, the state governor's office, from different state agencies, from Alaska Natives, you name it. And then there were also input coming in, letters left and right, NGOs, think tanks, the Arctic Council work groups themselves, it goes on. When all of these came in, State Department tried to go through the paces and consider a whole huge list of things. I'll just go through 4 for you to illustrate what we're trying to juggle here and how we can't please everyone, but we're going to try. First and foremost, is it something that's actually appropriate and feasible for the council? Like Fran said, this operates by consensus. It's a loose forum, so it's not one that's going to be forming regulation. So is the issue at hand really appropriate for this, or should it go to a different international forum that might be more appropriate? Is it circumpolar in nature? Ideally, we're going to put forward issues that will appeal to just more than one of the other Arctic states. Hopefully, everyone would have some buy-in to this. So it wouldn't be something that, say, we could deal with on a bilateral nature or something that may be more domestic. Ideally, is this issue going to help us to advance national priorities, the national strategy that Fran mentioned? Hopefully, where we can, we'll also put some of that into our work in the council. And last but not least, we're constantly considering our capacity. Do we have the funds? Do we have the bodies? Do we have the time to take some of this on? And through all of this, we're trying to push something out there that's going to be a really robust agenda, a really ambitious agenda, and we've put it out to the other Arctic states 7 months ahead of our chairmanship. And again, I think that's really unique to have so much detail already on the table for them to consider. Not just to get to consensus, but to really make sure that we really have buy-in, and that we have buy-in through domestic audiences and with the partners that we need to get this done. So now, like Fran mentioned, we have our chairmanship organized into these 3 different themes or pillars. Again, I'll try and go through this a bit quickly, but bear with me. For our first thematic area, Arctic Ocean safety, security, and stewardship, to give you a flavor of what we're trying to propose under this pillar. Search and rescue exercises, as were mentioned, are very important. The U.S. is hoping to host the other Arctic states through a tabletop exercise, and if resources allow, an actual live exercise, both to take place in Alaska during our chairmanship. We'd like to continue working on marine environmental protection, especially oil spill prevention and response, mainly through information sharing and understanding each country's capacity. We'd like to move forward on some work that the Council's already been doing, and very scientific in nature, for Arctic ocean acidification, and that is to link to the global ocean acidification observing network and make sure that we have more thorough participation from the various Arctic states, again, kind of increase the monitoring that we have right now, hopefully with a better understanding of science, and then messaging and policy action afterwards. A regional seas program for the Arctic Ocean is something that we'd like to ask the other Arctic states in particular to consider whether or not we should take this up. In short, this would be the idea of looking to establish a regional seas agreement of sorts that we see in other regions of the world, where multilateral cooperation can really help to manage an ocean, whether that be to organize a research agenda or different governance practices as needed. So we'll see if the other Arctic states would like to take that up, and right now the scope is very loose. And Marine Protected Areas Network, I'll try and give you an example for one of the projects as to really what we're talking about here, what we'd put forward. For this, to underscore the importance of the Arctic Ocean to the region, we want to enhance the ongoing work that the Council is already doing, where they're evaluating the prospects for developing a pan-Arctic network of MPAs. One of the working groups is moving towards launching this framework at the Canadian Ministerial in just a few months. So under our chairmanship, we'd like to implement that. We'd really like to start to see some more collaboration happening on the ground, or on the ocean, I should say, between the different MPAs, such that there's better collaboration, better info sharing between the existing MPAs. And then we'd also like to ask the Arctic states to consider whether or not we should set some sort of an Arctic-wide target for protecting marine areas of the Arctic Ocean and adjacent seas. And this is coming from the Our Oceans Conference that you may have heard of, which took place last year in Washington, D.C., where world leaders were looking at marine protection writ large around the globe. And so now we might be able to see, is there a way to translate that, where applicable, to the Arctic Ocean? And how can we try and move that bigger goal forward, if we so choose? I want to underscore that if this project is to come forward during the chairmanship, the U.S. plans to lead this by making sure that as we're examining the various models of marine protected areas, we do this with an eye towards ecosystem-based management and taking into account all of the activity which is occurring in the Arctic and which is predicted to increase. Especially, I want to underscore the subsistence aspect, which we all know is very vital to residents of the coastal areas of the Arctic. The second theme is improving economic and living conditions. Like Fran mentioned, it's really to hopefully continue this really good emphasis that Canada has put on the Arctic Council during their chairmanship. There's a slew of projects here, so bear with me. The first is the Arctic Water Resources Vulnerability Index. This is an initiative out of University of Alaska, a way to someone in the community to basically quantify how they're doing in terms of water security. And if we can work with our international partners to broaden that out, we'd hopefully have an idea of how different communities are all doing if you'd stack them up against one another. And that then leads into the next one, the Freshwater Security Initiative we want to tie into the Council's work. This would be to first set up some sort of a synthesis so that we just understand what's the current state of knowledge for freshwater security for communities in particular, but also for other ecosystems in the Arctic. And then ideally we lead ourselves to do a robust assessment, maybe coming on after the US chairmanship. Suicide prevention and resilience is an issue that the Council has been working on for several years. We'd like to make sure that that issue maintains a really prominent concerted effort in the working groups. And for that, as we understand it, the next step that we've been hearing it would really be appropriate to take place is some sort of a set of model indicators that are more universal, such that we can have experts communicating on different correlates, interventions, et cetera, track them and see how we're doing, with the idea that in the long term, we'll try and get to some sort of impact tools we can use on the ground and really reduce the incident of suicide. Community sanitation and public health is related to a project that the state of Alaska is launching. They have a water and sewer challenge, which is going to grant technologies that are trying to improve the access to clean water and sanitation in rural villages in Alaska. And we'd like to set up the opportunity for more info sharing amongst US and other experts around the world. Sorry, I skipped renewable energy demonstrations. Similar to community sanitations, this one is to build off of a US project and hopefully link more experts around the world to talk about this topic, talk about the availability of renewable energy right now in the Arctic, how we can try and promote it, how we can gain access to it. It's going to build off of a domestic project called the Remote Community Renewable Energy Partnership. And through that, we're hoping that we can start to at least build on some international discussions on this topic, and it's a new area of work for the council. And like I did last time, I'll try and illustrate one of these for you in a little bit more detail. For telecommunications infrastructure, I don't have to tell anyone who's visiting today from the Arctic that now all of a sudden you're in the metropolis of Seattle and your access to telecommunications has vastly improved. Essentially, it's lacking in the Arctic, and we see a need to improve it, not only because there are needs in communities, but as we see increased activities, we see increased needs, say, for search and rescue, make sure we're prepared for any kind of emergencies that may come forward. We have to start to tackle infrastructure issues such as telecommunications. We like to do this through a new expert group that we can form in the council, bringing together industry, government officials, and end users, which I should add here was a new suggestion we just got, so that we can develop some sort of an Arctic-wide assessment. And this is, again, building off of a U.S. initiative that's already going on through our National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and would hope to have similar assessments going on in all of the other states. Knitted together, we can have, hopefully, a more pan-Arctic picture of where are the gaps, where can we move forward, and ideally this would all then lead to a presentation to the International Telecommunications Union and the private sector, and lead to some real private-public partnerships that are going to happen if we're going to really see change in this. The third pillar, but not least, is addressing the impacts of climate change. As was mentioned, the area is changing more rapidly than others around the globe, so we're trying to really make sure that this maintains good prominence in our chairmanship. The first short-lived climate pollutants, like Fran had mentioned, the council has been working on some of these for quite some time. Now it's begun to hone in on black carbon and methane as the area where it can really lend some action to what other fora are doing around the world on climate change. We're about to have a framework for black carbon and methane come out at the Canadian Ministerial in a few months. So under our chairmanship, we have the opportunity to finally implement that. And what that's really going to mean for us is following each country to make sure that domestically they're holding to these commitments that we're going to make. We'll hopefully have national inventories coming out that we can then bring back to the council, reassess and see if there's need for more cooperation, share of best practices, new policy, et cetera. To enhance Arctic climate science, we have two projects that we're hoping to launch under that. The first is Climate Change Indicator System for the Arctic. It's essentially a move that the White House has put forward, and now with a new Arctic focus, and that is to predict climate change impacts and effects that are still centuries out and haven't yet come by using indicators that we can measure today, physical, biological, et cetera. For the Pan-Arctic Digital Elevation Map, the U.S. Geological Survey plans to work with the mapping organizations from the other Arctic states to pull together the digital elevation maps that we already have so that we'll finally have one map for the whole Arctic, ideally one that's publicly accessible, somehow available for download, for example, or on one platform, which we don't have just now. And lastly, again, I'll do a bit of a deeper dive, this time for Arctic climate adaptation and resilience. For this effort, we're hoping to have one that's really integrated, that will look at improving adaptation and resilience to climate change impacts in both communities and also natural ecosystems. It's a kind of a three-pronged effort. The first prong is to increase information of what's known, what's needed, mainly through advancing monitoring efforts and enhancing scientific understanding of resilient communities and ecosystems. There are a myriad of ways we plan on going about this, each sort of minor, but hopefully leading into something bigger. Two examples is the completion that we hope to do under our chairmanship of the currently ongoing Arctic Resilience Report and the Adaptation Actions for a Changing Arctic, two big efforts that the council right now has underway. The second, after we have the information, hopefully you can put these into some real usable tools. So we'd like to develop and promote tools and services that will help actual community planners, policymakers, make really good decisions when they're dealing with some of these issues, like Rachel mentioned, the need to move or relocate, and make sure that we're doing those with the best tools available. So for that, again, there's many ways we're going to go about this. One, hopefully have more policy-relevant recommendations coming out of the big scientific assessments that I mentioned in the first bullet. We're going to build on the Arctic Adaptation Exchange Portal, which the Canadian chairmanship will soon be launching. And that'll be a place where someone can go and hopefully download some of these tools or get access to them. And I also want to mention that throughout this effort of adaptation and resilience, we're going to have a new focus for the Arctic Council on addressing invasive species, a problem that has not yet struck most of the Arctic, but one in which we know there are some lessons learned from the lower 48 and from other regions, and we can hope to have those tools at hand for people in the Arctic so that they can be on the lookout for them and their impacts, especially for biodiversity. And lastly, once you have information and tools, hopefully you can then start to take action. And for this, we'd like to do it at the highest level possible, calling on member states, permanent participants, and other members from the global community, say some of those observers that Fran had mentioned, to work together to actually implement action and policies that will help us respond to the climate change vulnerabilities in the Arctic. And again, we can do this in many ways, but just to list a couple that the Arctic Council often takes on, we can identify priorities, have experts do that, and we can develop best practices. I would like to touch on strengthening the council. It can be a bit boring and a bit administrative, but our senior Arctic official, Julie Gorley, who's the longest serving senior Arctic official, I should mention now, for about 10 years, sees this as a really big part of our mission for our chairmanship. If we can strengthen the council, we can make sure that it's still a forum which is well-functioning, which is still going to be relevant, and can still can take on the big needs of the day. There's a whole slew of ways that we can go about this. Most of them will be the senior Arctic officials working directly with one another, but I wanted to give you a little bit of the flavor of what we mean when we say strengthening the council. For one, we can start to really examine how we're currently working with observers and how we can maybe change that and improve it as we go forward. We could discuss new ways of working with them so that they can more meaningfully contribute to the work of the council. I think there are some observers who are clamoring for that, and indeed the council, of course, could benefit for some more of their contribution. Collaboration with others, this is to get at the point that there are more and more Arctic-related entities popping up every day, it seems. And we need to figure out a way that the council can still share information with those entities and that they too can provide information to the council while yet still being independent. So an example of those that have come about recently, the Arctic Economic Council, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, the soon-to-be Arctic Offshore Regulators Forum, and the Arctic Regional Hydrographic Commission. So hopefully together we can come up with some good ways to do this collaboration. Internal structure, like Fran said, for 20 years, the council has more or less remained static in its structure, even though the work it's taken on has been very dynamic and changed quite a lot. But the structure itself hasn't changed. And is it now maybe time to revisit that structure and find out, is the structure serving our current needs? Does it need to be modernized in any way? And I also wanted to mention for you an archiving project. This actually may be of interest to you, in that we're going to be building off an initiative that Canada has started, hopefully finalizing it during our chairmanship, to create sort of one repository for all the archives for the council. As chairmanships have rotated country to country, you find documents sort of sparsed out throughout the world, sitting with different secretariats. We're hoping now that they'll all be in one spot. They'll be publicly accessible, kept up to date, et cetera. And last but not least, our last goal, public outreach. We'd like to launch a really big campaign to take advantage of this opportunity. This would largely be taking place outside of the Arctic Council. This would be one that we're doing during our chairmanship. We plan to conduct a widespread, intensive outreach campaign, and it's very broad in scope. We can take it in many different directions, but we've laid out at least 3 goals for ourselves to try and focus this. First and foremost, we'd like to educate the U.S. public, our own public, about why the Arctic matters and its strategic importance to our country. It's not lost on us on D.C., those of us who try and work on this policy every day, that even though we are making a lot of improvement, like Fran mentioned, from the White House and from our leadership, it's not part of our national identity, and we need to remind people that we are an Arctic nation. So that'll be our number 1 priority. We'd also like to educate the public about climate change impacts in the Arctic and how those are affecting our country, and then related, educate the rest of the world about how the Arctic is impacting them. We're going to do this, like I said, in sort of a smattering of ways, a full frontal attack, if you will. There are a lot of avenues at our disposal. Many of this will be done with partnering with outside groups because the State Department is not very good or used to messaging to domestic audiences. We're used to doing it internationally. So this will be one that hopefully we'll be able to put together such that we can promote education, media, through different speaking engagements, cultural events, etc. I wanted to quickly just mention some other parallel activities that are going on in the next 2 years. These are some that we'd like to prioritize during our chairmanship, but they're not technically part of our chairmanship or part of the council, if you can get that nuance. One is the State Department has launched a new Arctic Fulbright initiative. This is unique in that it's one of the rare times where the Fulbright takes on sort of a group effort. There'll be about a couple dozen scholars working on a whole slew of Arctic issues, many of those actually relating to our chairmanship topics. They'll be doing this in sort of parallel to our chairmanship, hopefully culminating with a big report and announcements of their findings that would take place alongside of our ministerial meeting when our chairmanship is done in spring 2017. Ideally, we will then interest the next chair, Finland, that comes after us, to host a similar Fulbright initiative and carry on. I also wanted to mention that University of Alaska Fairbanks is going to host a model Arctic Council for students from the 8 Arctic states. It's sort of similar to a model UN, if you're familiar with that. They're going to be hosting this alongside one of the senior Arctic officials that we will be hosting in Fairbanks during our chairmanship. So as a component of a youth initiative, we'll try and see if we can benefit youth and give them a taste of what it is to play diplomacy for a day or two. And again, I don't want to step on the toes of our next speaker, so I won't go into depth here, but I'll just mention that another big effort we'd like to prioritize for the U.S. in the next 2 years is the continuation of the Polar Code through the International Maritime Organization, sort of working on phase 2 and building off of the work that's already been done. And I'll leave the rest for Dr. Brigham. And that's all. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you both. We have some time for questions. Microphones set up on either side of the room, so if you would come up to the microphone, perhaps state your name and ask your question. And we would ask for questions, not lectures, if you would. I'll take the prerogative of starting off. This was a impressive and ambitious, it seems, agenda for the U.S. chair of the Arctic Council. And yet, I think you mentioned that this is a consensus organization. There's lots of constraints. Of that whole panoply of possible things to do, I guess my question for you would be, is there one thing in there, if you had to look back at our chair and say, well, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we did get one really important thing that you wanted to see done, what would that one thing be?
That's a good question, Brendan. And I neglected to mention that everything I laid out for you would take place in addition to the ongoing work of the council. So it really is going to be a very big lift for the next 2 years. And it is consensus-based. When you chair the council, however, you're given a little bit of leeway to set an agenda, if you will. So of course, we're still looking for consensus, but I think others will be happy to go along with us, at least on some of these initiatives. So to get to your question on where we're trying to prioritize this, I'll at least then defer to our senior Arctic official who has mentioned that if there's an area that we should really like to push, it's the new work that you see in that second pillar of improving economic and living conditions, telecommunications and renewable energy as 2 topics that have not yet been explored in the council, but we think we're just about to introduce them, and this could be the beginning of really good initiatives that we could see for chairmanships to come.
Fran, what would be your big disappointment?
I'd just add one of the important names that hasn't come up yet this morning, but needs to, is Admiral Bob Papp. One of the other things that the United States has done recently that hadn't existed before was creating a special representative to the Arctic. And Admiral Papp was named to that position last summer. Even though his name hasn't come up yet, he is sort of an overarching figure within the State Department and within these initiatives in terms of helping to guide the direction of the work and assuring that the relationships that we have had for a long time with the other nations that are part of the Arctic Council continue and strengthen. I think if Admiral Papp were sitting on this panel, he would put special emphasis on safety, security, and stewardship of the Arctic Ocean. His many days at the U.S. Coast Guard and his understanding of how essential it is that the countries in the North work together to do this. The Arctic Ocean is really a shared space kind of place, because what happens in Russia may have a big impact on what happens in Alaska, and because of the way in which marine mammals migrate and ocean currents, et cetera, we're really in this together. And the extent to which, particularly in a body like this one, which is to collaborate, to coordinate, it's not to run off and do something on our own, it's to find that place where by working together, we can really improve the entire region. And so this notion of really putting increased emphasis on doing the various things that each and every one of the countries that border the Arctic Ocean, but actually all of the countries that in one way either run ships through there, do research in there, rely on fisheries from adjacent areas, I think that stewardship responsibility would be one of his priorities to add to this conversation.
Thank you. And we have a couple questions. I'll start over here.
My name is Marilyn Hyman. I'm the director of the U.S. Arctic Program for Pew Charitable Trusts, and I'm glad, well, thank you both for your comments. They're both excellent, and every time I hear a presentation about the Arctic Council, I learn more, and I'm still confused. But I wanted to ask about the executive order and the Arctic team that's been put together, because my understanding was Admiral Papp was looking to build a team that would include tribal representatives on it, and I was curious how that progress was going.
Sure. I can speak to the team. Do you want to speak to the executive order? Sure. Edward? So for the team that we're building in the State Department, I'm happy to say it's growing because we need more help. As Fran mentioned, Admiral Papp is sort of at the helm of it, if you will, overarching as our coordinator. Secretary Kerry will be the chair of the council when we assume the chairmanship, but of course will not be engaged with us day to day, so thank goodness we have Admiral Papp for some of that overall guidance. When you chair the Arctic Council, you also have another seat at the table with the senior Arctic officials, and that is the person who chairs the senior Arctic officials, helps to set the agenda for their meetings, et cetera. That person has yet to be named for the U.S., but we'll have someone in our team who would also play that role. Of course, then we have our senior Arctic official, Julie Gorley, and then sort of below her you have myself and many other staff, which is still growing. For your specific question, Admiral Papp, he does intend to hire Alaska Native liaisons. I believe 2 or 3 or so, although I don't know the details, and we are looking to do that before the chairmanship, and this would hopefully be people who are based in Alaska, who have very good connections, and who can help us not just guide some of these initiatives as we do them, but also help us to inform how we're running some of our meetings, how we're doing some of our outreach alongside these meetings. There will be a slew of meetings taking place, most of those in Alaska, and there's a lot of opportunity to build events around that. There's a lot of need to introduce the international visitors that we have to Alaska, and so that's where we're really hoping these liaisons can help with.
And actually the State Department is also in active conversations with the governor's office about the best way to assure some continuing and meaningful dialogue with the state of Alaska. I noticed that Craig Fleener is here with us today, and I don't know if Craig's going to say a few words or not, but he is kind of the point person, as I understand it, for Arctic issues for the state of Alaska. So there's also going to be kind of a framing in a way that really makes it easier for the state of Alaska to understand what's going on and the various organizational meetings that will be held in Alaska. There will be quite a few of them, actually, to increase the amount of communication and dialogue. So you asked about the executive order. The executive order just came out last week, and so it's still very much a new thing. It will be steered by a steering committee, and there are a number of people that are listed in the executive order that are members of the steering committee that will be chaired by John Holdren. John Holdren is the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I think one thing that we should try to keep clear in our minds, and this is kind of confusing, but let me try this. There's the Arctic Council efforts underway, and there is the National Arctic Strategy, the implementation, and the executive order. And just to, not that they're not in some ways connected, they are in some ways connected, and in some ways some of the people go back and forth. But the National Arctic Strategy you need to think of as sort of the US agenda for the Arctic. And every one of the 8 Arctic nations has a National Arctic Strategy. And they're actually pretty much all the same. They talk about stewardship, they talk about security, they talk about international cooperation and coordination. There's a lot of similarity, whether you're reading the one from Russia or from Norway or from the US. So that National Arctic Strategy and the implementation plan and now the executive order and the steering committee is really kind of focused on that versus this whole effort that Adrianna just described to you, which is the working groups and the efforts to flesh out the programs and the projects under the US chairmanship, which don't think of so much as a US thing, think of it as an international space. The Arctic Council is a consensus entity that moves forward together, not unilaterally. So both of these things are kind of happening at the same time, and as I said, there is some overlap of both people and issues, but they're kind of best to keep in your mind as moving in a parallel course. I don't know if that helps any, but I hope it does.
So we have a question over here on my right.
Yes. Hi, my name is Dave. I'm a graduate student here in public administration. And I just had a quick question for really both or either of you. I know that in the past, there's been a large need for increased amounts of black carbon, methane, oceanographic data coming from Russia. And I'm curious, since the Task Force on Science Cooperation is getting its legs, and I think there's a new working group now, particularly on short-lived climate forcers, what's the vision or the policy for how to interact with Russian scientific agencies given the kind of diplomatic freeze today?
Well, it's an excellent question and one that's a little hard to answer because it's a mixed bag. There are still some ways in which the communication and the flow of information has been moving forward and continuing as though nothing else was happening in other parts of the world. And I was just at Tromsø for the Arctic Frontiers meeting a week before this one, and there were Russian participants, there were spokespeople that talked in the same language that we talk about how important it is that the 8 Arctic nations move forward together in a climate of openness and cooperation. But having said that, obviously the tensions spill over in some ways in terms of who comes to meetings, who feels comfortable making different kinds of speeches on different kinds of topics. And in some instances, there has been a slowdown of the flow of information that one would hope for. So it's a mixed picture at this point, but I remain hopeful that we are able to keep the Arctic a zone where the emphasis is still on what we share by way of common goals and objectives and opportunities to cooperate. The extent to which we can continue on the path we're on remains to be seen and is out of our control and really has less to do with what's happening in the Arctic and what's happening elsewhere. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll tack on to that for the 2 topics that you mentioned in particular. And Fran sort of phrased it the right way. It's a mixed bag. So for example, the Scientific Cooperation Task Force that we have ongoing, it listed Russia as a co-chair, and they are very much an active co-chair. They really are partnering extremely well with us on leading that effort forward, and they have a strong vision to get us through to an agreement in the next couple years. So for that, I'd say the cooperation is excellent. For the black carbon work, for example, We also expect that they'll come along with this framework, which we hope to have signed and approved at the Canadian Ministerial, and then we're going to launch into implementation. And that's where it's really domestic efforts, and we'll see how domestically each country is addressing some of these needs and new commitments. So that's where we hope to remain hopeful that we'll see something coming from Russia at that part, and that they really do fulfill these commitments that they've made. I mean, in general, everyone realizes it's in all of our interest to still cooperate in the Arctic. Russia sees that, and so do we. And so while we have really strong sanction regime in place, we are still trying to cooperate, at least under the auspices of the Arctic Council where possible.
Yeah, thank you.
And over here on the left.
Thank you. I'm Miko Moret with the Polaris Group in London. I had 3 very short questions. The first one is, you said, Dr. Muir, you said earlier that you would review the way the council works with observers. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what you think should be changed at this point? Then my second question is, there are many applicants for observership that are lining up: Estonia, Mongolia, Mexico. So how do you see these applicants? And then my third question is, how do you welcome the EU's Arctic strategy that is to be issued on December 2015?
Okay, I'll try and remember each of those. And you said they're short questions, but I think the answers are very long. It could be at least.
Indeed.
First, your question on how we can strengthen the council by working more with observers. I think right now what we've seen is it's a bit of a hodgepodge, and so observers, for the most part, participating in the different working groups, but it doesn't seem to be uniform. In some working groups, they seem to be giving more substantial contributions than in others. So I think we'd like to allow a way for the senior Arctic officials to decide how we can do that more uniformly and how we can maximize it to a level in which everyone's very comfortable with their contributions. For the second question on the long list of observers, the docket right now is already quite long, and like you mentioned, it's probably going to grow. We've heard interest from Mexico, Argentina, and others who haven't yet applied, but likely will. Well, first, we'll look at those when the applications come through, and it's time to review them based on a set of criteria. There are criteria which were agreed to in 2011, I believe it was, and so, of course, we'll review it against those. The council, though, is also at a point where we have so many observer applications. If all those were to come in, you're vastly outnumbering the member states and the permanent participants. And while the member states are those that are really driving the decisions, we need to make sure that we don't somehow lose the power that the permanent participants have at the table. And it's a unique forum because they're at the table with everyone in. So I think that's where the real rub will come in, and we're going to need to see some good leadership from the U.S. in the next couple of years to address all this interest that we're seeing from the globe. Your last question was for the EU Arctic strategy, and I didn't know that they had one that's going to come out later this year, so I must admit, I'm curious. Now I'm looking forward to it.
I might just tack on the EU question. Last week, I co-chaired a meeting between the EU, Canada, and the United States on the topic of scientific cooperation. And unquestionably, the EU's interest in the Arctic and ability to contribute both financially and in terms of professional expertise to Arctic research needs to be recognized as a positive contribution in whatever format, whether it's directly as an observer or indirectly through partnerships, trilaterals like the one we had last week. The EU strategy, which was based on a year-and-a-half research project that basically looked at the EU in the Arctic and the Arctic in the EU. If people haven't read that, I would suggest actually reading it. It's an excellent document that puts into focus the extent to which the Arctic is a shared space. Thanks.
We have time for one last question over here.
I'll be brief. I'm Irene from Fairbanks. I'm here informally as a member of the subarctic farming community. I wanted to reference thematic area 2, and I applaud you for working on water security issues. And I was wondering if you had considered the broader concept of food security issues, and even perhaps more importantly to the permanent participants, food sovereignty issues, and if you had considered maybe expanding the water security concept into that larger venue.
That's a great question. And it has come up from time to time. There's a good interest in working on food security. I don't think that the council has ever had a concrete proposal come forward yet on the topic. I know there are conversations underway now to consider whether or not there's a way to address salmon, especially in a subsistence light, and maybe that would tie into the freshwater piece. Sovereignty hasn't come up, though, as far as I understand, and maybe that's because it's more of domestic nature in terms of how it's regulated, but that's a great comment. Thank you.
Join me in thanking both of our speakers for this very informative session. Thank you.